Welcome to the most easy to understand, most visual, and most interactive Python crash course on YouTube. Now, this course isn't going to teach you everything about Python, but hopefully you'll come out of this thinking, oh, Python wasn't as hard as I thought it was. Now, the best way to learn programming isn't just through practice, but also by automating a personal pain point with code, because it helps you understand the relevance of what you're doing. If you code stuff that doesn't solve or automate anything, you'll probably get unmotivated pretty quickly. So the pain point you'll be automating today is manually opening up a bunch of websites. Sounds pretty mundane, but hear me out. Let's say you're a stock investor and you've got 5 hot stocks on your radar. Every morning you open up 5 browser tabs and manually type in the Yahoo Finance URL of the 5 stocks. Pretty tedious, right? Well, what we're going to do instead is write a script that opens all 5 URLs in one go. Look at that magic. I can even put the script on the desktop, and every time I click it, the 5 websites open. You'll also do some basic arithmetic calculations, but for now, your focus will be to automate the process of opening the 5 URLs. At the same time, you'll be learning about these programming basics, but don't worry about them for now. I'll explain what they are as we code. Alright, the crash course starts now, so let's jump on the computer. So the first thing we're going to do is install Python. So we'll go to python.org, hover over to downloads and select the one for your operating system. I'm on Windows, so I'll click this one. And when it finishes downloading, open it up. And before you click anything else, tick this Add Python 3.9 to path. It'll come in handy later. Click the Install Now button and give it a minute or so. I'm going to speed up this video. And hooray, setup was successful. We'll click Close, and to double check that you installed Python properly, we'll go to the Start menu, open the command prompt, and in the window here, I want you to type in Python space _version. Press enter, and you should see the Python number that you installed, and mine was 3.9.6. Awesome, we installed it successfully. You can close this now. Next, we'll open up our code editor, which is called idle. It's the default one that comes with Python. So we'll go to our Start menu, type in IDLE for idle, and this thing here will open up called the idle shell. This shell shows us the output of our code. And to write a new script, all we do is go to File and New File, and now you have 2 windows open. Let me just rearrange these. So what we have here is the shell here on the left and the code editor on the right. The code editor window is where you'll be writing all your code, and the shell spits out the result of your code. So code editor is the input and the shell is the output. Okay, so now we're going to write a script that opens 5 browser tabs. In the code editor, I want you to type in import and web browser as one word. And then press enter twice, and then type in web browser.open, and then put these open and close brackets, and then in between the brackets, you're going to put in 2 single quotes. And then in between the quotes, we're going to put the Yahoo Finance URL in here. So we'll copy this, minimize it, and we're going to paste that in between the quotes. Now these 2 lines are going to open up a web browser window, and it's going to go to the Yahoo Finance website. So to run our code, we go to Run at the top here and Run Module, or press F5. And it says before we can run our script, we need to give it a name. So we'll press OK to save it, and let's save it to our downloads folder, and we'll call it maybe URL_opener. Press enter, and look at that, it's opened the Yahoo Finance website. So if we close this window and we run our code again with F5, that's pretty cool. With 2 lines of Python, we've opened up the web browser. So if we want to open the 4 other stocks, we just copy this line and paste it 4 more times underneath and change the URL So we'll update the ticker name here. So we'll go Apple, Facebook, Tesla, AMD, and just for lols, GameStop, Apes, Strong Together, and so forth. And then what we can also do is go to the downloads folder, and when we double click or open this, it opens all 5 websites for us. That's pretty cool. So there you go, pain point solved, objective completed. But you probably didn't learn anything from that, right? I mean, I didn't even explain what the first line did. And I promised to explain all these other programming basics to you as well. So let's dive into that now. Okay, the first thing we're going to learn about are libraries, which are kind of like mods and upgrades you can bolt on to Python. You see, Python by itself doesn't come with a lot of features. It just gives you the bare minimum. If I were to use a car analogy, Python is like a base model Corolla. You install the shell, which is the engine of the car here, and then you're controlling it with your code editor here. But your base model is missing stuff like reverse sensors, a reverse camera, and aircon. And that's what libraries are. It gives you additional functionality to Python, and that's what this first line does. It imports a library called web browser into our script. Now, there are some libraries that come with Python, like web browser, and all you have to do is import it at the start of your script. And then there are other libraries written by third parties and companies that you have to download first before you can import them. We won't be covering them in this video, but I'll cover them in the next one. For now, we're just going to focus on libraries that come with Python. Then in order to use the web browser library, all we have to do is use its name. So we just go web browser, and then we press dot, and if we press tab, you can see we're given a list of functions that we can use for web browser. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here. And to see what each of them do, you can Google the documentation. So we'll go to Python web browser. Let's just type that into Google, and we'll go to the first link that sends us to docs.python.org. And you can see here in the documentation that, yep, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 functions. So we've used the open function here. And the documentation is telling us that we have to supply a URL after the open bracket. Now, when you see words after a bracket in Python, they're basically called parameters. So in this line, we're passing the URL as a parameter into the web browser.open function. And if I finish this line with open, and then I open the bracket, you can see that we're given this hint that we need to supply a URL. Okay, that's it for libraries. I'll just add a comment at the top here to say that we're importing a library. And by the way, comments are ignored in Python and they never get executed. So it's a great way to document your code. We just add a hash to the side of our code here, or we can do it at the top. I prefer at the top here. And we can write something like import the web browser library. And then down here, we open the following web pages. Moving on to the rest of the basics. Now, we won't be adding additional functionality to our script. So I guess in terms of automating the process of opening a bunch of websites, that's done. But what we're going to learn now are the other basic programming concepts to make our code more dynamic moving forward, and hopefully you can adapt these learnings into your own project. So the next thing we're going to learn about are variables. Now, all variables do is store values like text and numbers, but not like forever. As soon as the program finishes running, Python forgets all about text and numbers. Now, in Python, when you see stuff wrapped in a single quote, double quote, or triple quote, it's called a string or a text, and the URL here is an example of that. So what we can do is store these URLs into a string variable. So what I want you to do is make some space in between the import web browser line and the comment line. And I want you to type in URL1 equals this URL with the single quotes in it. So we'll select this, cut it, and paste it in here. Then we'll copy this 4 more times, 1, 2, 3, 4, and update the numbers to URL 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll change the ticker name here to Facebook, Tesla, AMD, and GameStop. Now, suddenly we've created 5 string variables, and you can add a comment above here like URLs stored as variables. That's what this code is doing. Next, all you have to do is substitute the variable names, which is URL 1 to 5, into the web browser.open function. So without quotes, we'll go URL 1, and then let's just make this easier, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll go URL 2, 3, 4, and 5. We'll save our script with Control S and press F5 to run it. And perfect, everything's still working. Our 5 websites have been opened. Now, programmers don't like repeating the same lines of code, which is kind of what we're doing here and here. Like the URL is essentially the same up until this point where we get to the ticker name, and we're repeating webbrowser.open 5 times, which is kind of redundant. So we're going to store our variables in a more tidy fashion and streamline the webbrowser.open function. Let's start with the variables first. Now, if you're in a situation where you have a bunch of variables that are like similar or run in some sort of sequence like these URLs, it might be better to store them in a list instead of 5 individual variables. So to store them in a list, what I want you to do is add a new line under the variable comment and type in URL underscore list equals open square bracket and close square bracket. And in between the square brackets, I want you to type in 2 single quotes, comma, another set of single quotes, comma, and do this till you get 5 of them inside the square brackets. So we've got a total of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 single quotes and 5 commas. Now, when it comes to lists, they use square brackets as the syntax. If you see square brackets in Python, it means you're dealing with a list. And each value in between the commas is called an item. So this here is an item, that's an item, that's an item, that's an item, and that's an item. So right now we've created 5 blank items inside the list. And within these quotes, we're going to substitute our 5 URLs into the list. And just quickly, variable names can't have spaces. So that's why we have to use an underscore instead. So we'll put in Apple, and then Facebook. And if it's getting hard to read, you can press enter after each comma. Then we'll add Tesla, AMD, and GameStop. And then we can delete the 5 URL variables underneath. So we've put our 5 URLs into a list. Now we just need to update our webbrowser.open functions at the bottom. So your first thought is probably to just go webbrowser.open URL underscore list. So let's try that and see what happens. So we'll update this to URL list, save it with Control S and press F5 to run. And we get this error that says we can only use string, bytes, or a file path and not a list inside this webbrowser.open function, which means it essentially only accepts text. But technically speaking, a list isn't text, it's a list. But each individual item inside the list is a text. So if we want to access each individual item inside the list, all we have to do is add these square brackets followed by the item number. Item numbers start at 0 or index 0. So if we put a 0 in here and we run it, we should get back Apple. And we'll just comment these 4 lines underneath. We'll save and run that. And there you go, we've got the Apple website. So we'll close this. Now you could copy and paste this line 4 more times, so we end up with this. And we can probably delete these ones now. And we can go 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that'll give us Apple, Facebook, Tesla, AMD, and GameStop, but it doesn't streamline the code, does it? So what we're going to do is add a for loop. For loops let you repeat lines of code without having to actually type out that code. So what I want you to do is comment out all these web browser.open lines. Don't delete them just yet. And then make some space after the open the following web pages comment. And I want you to type in for x in URL underscore list colon. Now what this does is sequentially substitute each item in URL list into a temporary variable called x. And the reason why we put a colon here, I mean, it's part of the for loop syntax, but it's also to signify that there's also going to be a code block underneath, which means whatever code is underneath this colon, it's going to get executed 5 times because we have 5 items inside our list. So when I press enter after this colon, it's going to indent the code for us because we put a colon on the previous line. And then now we'll type in web browser.open, and instead of putting in URL list or URL list with the item number, we're going to put in X. So these 2 lines will replicate what these 5 lines do. So we'll save our script with Control S and press F5 to run. And awesome, all 5 pages open up. So what's happening here is this line creates a loop that repeats the code underneath 5 times because we have 5 items in URL list. As it's repeating the code, the loop also sequentially substitutes each item from URL list. So that's the first item here. It sequentially substitutes each item from that into the temporary variable x. So starting with the first item in URL list, it gets the Apple URL, and then it substitutes that into this value x. Once it's done that, it goes to the line underneath and executes it. So it's got web browser.openX, which is item number 1, and then it goes back to the start of the for loop and substitutes the next item into x, which is Facebook. So that gets put into x, and then it executes the code block underneath. It then goes back to the start of the loop, substitutes the next item into it, which is Tesla. It puts it into X, and then executes the code block underneath. And it keeps doing this until it gets to the end of the list, which is GameStop. Now we can name X any variable we want. I usually like to use variable names with more context. So instead of X, I might use something like each underscore URL. So it reads as, for each URL in the URL list, open the web browser and look up each URL instead of X. Okay, I hope that made sense. For loops are a bit tricky to understand, so rewatch that part if you have to and keep rerunning the code until you get it. And then we'll just add a for loop comment here that says, repeat the line below whilst substituting each item from URL list into each URL. The next thing to streamline is the URL list again. I mean, 90% of the URL is the same as each other. So what I want you to do is copy this section of the URL and delete it from URL list. So all that's left inside is the ticker name. So we can go Shift End to go to the end of the line, and then just go back until you get the / and delete it. Then inside our for loop, which we can probably delete these lines now, inside our for loop, we're going to update this to 2 single quotes plus the base URL. So we end up with this plus each URL. Let's save this with Control S and press F5 to run. Awesome, everything's working as expected. Now, this is kind of like the noob way to concatenate or join string together. Because if you need to join like 5 pieces of text, it can get really messy and you'll lose track of where to open and close the quotes and when to use these pluses. An easy way to concatenate string is with something called fstring or formatted string, which removes the need for these pluses and these quotes. And to use formatted string, what I want you to do is add an F before the first quote and move each URL inside the actual URL. And we'll delete this plus, and at the end of this URL, we'll put two curly braces, an open and close, and paste each URL inside it. The curly braces along with F will substitute the variables here into the string here. So we'll save and run that, and perfect. We have our 5 websites running. All right, the next thing we're going to learn about are arithmetic and comparison operators. Basically, how to add variables together and how to compare them with one another. So underneath your for loop, what I want you to do is make a few lines of space and create a new variable called capital equals 1000. And then let's pick a stock to analyze, like let's pick AMD, $110.11. So let's make a new variable underneath that called AMD underscore price equals $110.11. And then we'll put a comment underneath to ask how many units of AMD can we buy? And to answer that, I want you to type in AMD underscore units equals capital divided by AMD price. Obviously, if you want to use addition, you can use the plus sign, you can use the hyphen to subtract, and the star to multiply, but we'll stick with divide, which is a /. So if we save and run that, our 5 websites open, but AMD units is nowhere to be found. And that's because we haven't told our script to display the result of AMD units to the shell. And in order to do that, we use this thing called a print function. So underneath AMD units, we'll type in print, open close brackets, and in between the brackets, we'll type in AMD underscore units. We'll save it and run. The 5 websites open again, but most importantly, we get 9.08 units of AMD stocks. Now, the slight problem is you can't buy fractions of shares, so let's round down the calculation. Now, there is a round function in Python which looks like this. So you can see we've called the round function and we have to provide 2 parameters, the number we want to round and the number of digits to round it down to. So that's our number, capital divided by AMD price, comma, and we want to round it to 0. The problem with round is it keeps rounding to the nearest number. So if we have 1.5 as a number, it gets rounded up to 2. But in this case, we want to round down. So we need to use the math library in Python. So at the top here, we'll go import math. And instead of using round, we'll use math. So to use the library, we just put its name in the code, math dot. And if I press tab, the function we're looking for is floor. Floor gives us the bottom number to round down to. And we only had to pass in 1 parameter, so we can delete this comma 0. And if we save and run it, awesome, we get 9 exact units of AMD. Now we're going to move on to comparison operators, which is a way for us to compare variables. So right now I can only buy 9 units of AMD, but I want to write a check that automatically tells me if we can or can't buy 10 units of AMD. So we're going to check if AMD units is more than or equals to 10. So what we'll do is add another comment. We'll delete that print and it says, but I want to buy 10 units. And the check we're essentially writing is AMD units 10 or more? And to do that check, we'll create a new variable called AMD underscore check equals AMD underscore units more than or equals to 10. And we'll print out that result to our shell. So we'll save and run it. I've made a mistake there, it's AMD units. So we'll press save, run it again. And the shell tells us false. Now, when you use comparison operators like more than or less than, the answer you'll always get back is true or false. And in this case, we got false because AMD units equals to 9, and 9 is not more than or equals to 10. But if we change this value instead to 9, so that 9 isn't more than 9, but it is equal to 9. If we save this and run it, we should get back true. And there you go. Now, if you want to do other comparisons, you can do less than or equals to, you can do less than by itself, you can do not equals to, but we're going to stick with more than or equals to. Now, that's good to know that we can't buy more than 10 units of AMD, but I want a more personalized message. Just true or false is too ambiguous. So to get a more personalized message, we're going to use if statements. We're going to update our comparison here with if AMD underscore check is equal to true, and that's with 2 equals, close bracket, colon, print f string, yay, we can buy, curly braces, AMD units. So that gives us the number of AMD units we can buy. We can buy 9 units of AMD. Close the single quote and close bracket. And then when we press enter, our code's still going to be indented. So I want you to press backspace and then type in else, colon, enter. And the message we want to print here is f string, boo, we can only buy AMD units of AMD, sad face. Close the text and close the bracket. So what's going on here is at the top, we're using the if function to check if AMD is equal to true. So to compare one variable to another, we use 2 equals, and if we want to assign a value to a variable, we use 1 equals. Very important distinction there. Then we have a code block underneath because of the colon up here, and essentially this code only gets executed if this condition is true. If it isn't, which is where we use this else, then it prints out this other message. So right now this equals to true because we've got 9 units and that equals to 9. So if we save and run this, we should get back true in the console. Yay, we can buy 9 units of AMD. We can probably delete this line. But if I change this back to 10, which will make this false, and if we save and run, oops, that has to be more than or equals to. Boo, we can only buy 9 units of AMD. Alright, so we've got our personalized message, so that covers off if statements. Okay, the last thing that we need to cover off are custom functions. Now what you'll notice with this script is that it's doing 2 distinct things in here. First, it's opening a bunch of websites for us, and second, it's doing some other calculations. And if I only want to see the output of the calculations, it's kind of annoying because my browser has to open the 5 URLs first, I have to close it, and then I can only see what it's saying in the shell. Now I could just comment out this entire block here one by one, like line by line, but that's really tedious and not practical. So what we're going to do is make 2 custom functions and call them only when we need. And to define a function in Python, I want you to type this into your script at the top of URL list. So we'll go define or def, followed by the function name we want to give it. I'll do something like lookup underscore stocks, and then an open close bracket and colon. Then highlight the rest of your code up until the end of the webbrowser.open function and press tab. That's going to indent our code. And so now this code is wrapped inside the lookup stocks function and can only be executed when we call that function. We'll then create a second function just on top of capital and call it def calc underscore units, open close bracket, colon. We'll highlight the rest of our code, press tab to indent it. So what's happened here is that we've defined a function with the keyword def, followed by a custom name for the function, followed by an open close bracket and a colon. The colon again represents a code block underneath which only gets conditionally executed. Now there's more cool capability to this bracket, but I'll leave that for another video. If we save this code and run it, nothing actually happens. That's because we've only defined the functions, not called them. But it's super easy to call functions. We just type out the name of them. So at the top, we'll go and type in lookup underscore stocks with the open close bracket without the colon, and then we'll save that and run it. And now we got this error that says lookup stocks is not defined, but we can see it right here. And the reason we're getting that error is because Python executes code line by line from top to bottom. And we're calling this function before it's been defined. So all we have to do to call this function is move it to the bottom of our script. And then we'll also add calc units to that too. We'll save and run it. And awesome, our 5 websites and calculations in the shell are working. So if I only want to run the shell calculations, I can comment out the lookup stocks function, save and run that, and there you go. We've got the calculations there. And then to finish off, I'll just quickly add some comments. So custom function 1, open 5 URLs in the browser, and then custom function 2, calculate how many units we can buy. And would you give yourself a pat on the back? You've practiced building a script that automates a pain point and learnt about some of the basic programming principles. So what are the next steps from here? Well, I want you to take a breather and digest everything that you've learned. Rewatch certain parts if you have to, and drop me a question in the comments if some part of this didn't make sense. I'm more than happy to respond. Once you're comfortable with the script, I want you to try extrapolating the lookup stocks function to betting websites. Now, I'm not condoning gambling, but if you bet on a game, one website will probably have better odds than the other, so you want to find the best odds, right? And it can be a pain to open each page manually. So grab the URLs of 3 betting websites and try using everything you've learned here to get those pages open by themselves. Let me know how you go with that. If you've done those 2 things, then keep on the lookout for my next video, which will explain how to extract this AMD price automatically from Yahoo Finance instead of you having to manually type that in each time. If you want to try and do it on your own, the hint I'll leave you with is you have to use the Y Finance library. If you figure it out and get it working, let me know in the comments. Alright, that's it for this one. Reward yourself with a beer because that was a lot of information to absorb. Catch you in the next one. See you later.